Okay, all right. Welcome to our final class. Hard to believe that we've gone through them all already, all but one. And I'm excited about the last class because it's going to be a good one, but I'm really sad to have it be the last class, that's for sure. So this is formatted a little bit like the permaculture design course in that the first, like 2/3 of any permaculture design course talks about what we call the visible structures. In other words, plants, animals, shelter, water systems, things like that, the things that we can see and touch. And then the end of any permaculture design course talks about, we go into the invisible structures, things that have more to do with culture, economics, livelihood, justice, those sorts of things. And that's actually a little bit of what we're going to be doing here, in that this last class is looking more at ways to earn a living, livelihood, being more secure in lots of different ways, and not so much on the hardscape, on the landscape itself, but we'll of course integrate all kinds of things having to do with landscape into it. So I just wanted to get you up to speed on kind of the format here. So here's what we're going to do. This is lesson 5, a yard that provides money and more from your yard. And one of my favorite phrases, this is a designer friend of mine named Larry Santoyo came up with this. And Larry is really good. He's a phrase meister. He's terrific at coming up with catchy phrases. And he talks about reducing the need to earn. And I like the way that's phrased because it doesn't say you should spend less money or you should make less money or that money is bad or anything like that. It says just let's do things in our lives that make us less dependent on money, so that we're using money less or we need less money. But we don't necessarily have to, tighten our belts and, become all frugal and things like that. I mean, all those things are good to do. But the point is to reducing our need to earn so that we're freed up to do other things, so that we're not having to spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week working at a job, so that we can do other things with our lives. Because I think human beings are not meant to spend 40, 50, 60 hours in front of a computer screen or, punching a machine or doing one thing over and over again. We're one of the most flexible species on the planet. And the whole idea of a job is actually a really recent invention. So I really like this idea of reducing our need to earn. You can go ahead and earn as much as you want, but we're just less dependent on being forced to do that. So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at ways to get income from our yard. We explored that a little bit in the last class, but I'm going to go into a little more structure of that, really how to do it and how to think about it. Again, this class, like everything in permaculture, a lot of it has to do with how to think about these things, give you a toolkit, but also really how do we use that toolkit? How do we organize everything? So we've got a good set of tools, but really in permaculture, we're also looking at different ways of thinking about things. So that's what I want to focus on with income sources from our yard is how do we think about our yard and our home as a source of income for us. Then there's this really cool concept that a couple of young guys from the East Coast of the US came up with called the 8 forms of capital. And it's a really important tool, again, for reducing the need to earn. And I want to spend some time on that. And then we'll wrap up by putting all these pieces together, all the things that we've covered in the first 4 classes and this one, and really putting all the pieces together so that our landscape then becomes this source of security for us and allows us to face the future with very little fear, with this real sense of abundance rather than scarcity. All right, so let's dive in. First, just let's talk about money for a minute. Money is a strange thing. They've done surveys to show that people are much more comfortable discussing the intimate details of their sex lives than they are talking about how much money they earn. Like, people would much rather tell you almost anything other than how much they earn. We're not comfortable with money. We have a really, really weird relationship with money, and that's part of the problem. So let's look at that a little bit. How did we get here with this strange relationship with money? So there's this story that we're told that economists have And I think of it as the myth of barter. And the idea was that before money was invented, there was just the barter system where, I would make an axe and you would make shoes, and I would trade you an axe for, a certain number of shoes. And then the problem would be, well, what if you had an axe and I had shoes, and, so our transaction's over. Maybe everybody in the village has an axe and everybody in the village has shoes. So there's no way to make a livelihood for axe makers or shoemakers anymore. And it just got to be inconvenient to do things through barter. And so we invented money so that there was this medium of exchange that was flexible and we could do lots of different things with it. That's the myth of barter. And it turns out that there are pretty much no examples of any culture that has been primarily reliant on barter. That this doesn't really exist except in cultures that have really broken down, like in wartime. And even then, other things very often become the medium of exchange. It turns out that in disrupted societies, things like cigarettes become a medium of exchange. There's always something that acts like money. Rather, if they don't have money itself, if there's no, say, government to print currency and things like that, a substitute for money almost always comes up. So there is no such thing as a society that's based pretty much exclusively on barter. There's always been some other way of doing things. So this is a myth, this idea that we bartered, but it was really inconvenient, and then some genius invented money, and then we stopped needing to barter anymore. It turns out that most economies that don't use money are what we call gift economies. And there have been some really cool pieces of research done. One of the foremost researchers on this is a guy named Marcel Mauss, but there are a bunch of other people who have looked at this as well. And they found that almost always economies, societies that don't use money, have gift economies. And what that means is that let's see what I've got here. Yeah, that you bring something to your community. You'll, like, I've spent a fair amount of time in Hawaii, and they'll have luau's, and someone will say, well, I'll bring the pig this year, and someone else will say, well, I'll bring the breadfruit, and someone will say, well, let's have it at my house and I'll provide the fire, and someone else will bring the firewood and all sorts of things like that. And no one's really bringing money, and also people aren't really keeping track. Like, no one's really writing down, well, let's see, you brought a pig, and last year you didn't bring anything, and so you better bring something next year. That in these gift economies, it's not an exact exchange. That people will. It's basically just letting people know that you're contributing. That you're there, that you're reliable, that you're going to bring something. And, and I remember seeing in one of these luau's that someone, said, well, I was going to bring some bananas, but my bananas didn't work out this year. And people would, don't worry about it. You brought lots of stuff last year, so you get a free ride this year. And people know who's kicking down and who's not. People know who the slackers are in a small size community, and they know who the contributors are. And the thing about gift economies where, people just bring stuff and give it, and there isn't really an expectation of direct exchange. I'm going to give this, and you darn well better give me something in exchange. It's not really like that. What's interesting about the gift economy as opposed to a money economy is that once a money exchange is done, you make an axe and I buy it from you for $12.95 or whatever, and then it's done. And the term that economists use for that is, you are now alienated from your axe, and I am now alienated from my money. The transaction is completely over, it's stopped, and things are no longer flowing. Whereas with a gift economy, I'll give you, we'll go back to the idea of shoes or something like that. I'll give you a pair of shoes, you give me an axe, or you kick down an axe into the community pool or something like that. And the shoes and the axe aren't worth exactly the same amount. So there's always this little bit of extra. There's always you brought a little bit more last time, so that means that next time it's okay if you bring less, or maybe next time I should bring a bit more. In other words, you're never fully, as the economists would say, alienated from the exchange. There's always a little residue left. It never completely balances out. So they talk about what they call it is the gift continues to move. That and there's also a bond that's created. There's something very personal, like I'm going to look at that axe or those shoes or whatever it is and think, hey, so and so gave that to me. They made it. I know who they are. There's this personal relationship there now, as opposed to money where, well, transaction's over and, I just have this anonymous money or this anonymous thing that any old person could get and anyone could buy it and it doesn't really mean anything. So what this means is that in a gift economy, they talk about it being non-zero sum. In other words, there isn't a winner and a loser. There isn't someone who gains everything and someone who loses everything. And that's really what zero sum is, where everything adds up to zero when you're over with it. That with gifts, there's always a little extra, a little residue. And one of the really cool things about that is that in a gift economy, it gives us something to do with our surplus. It's always kind of a challenge, and this is why in permaculture, the third permaculture ethic has to do with returning the surplus or reinvesting the surplus. What do you do with that surplus? Well, in a gift economy, you just give it. You just put it into the center. You put it into the pool, and what that means is now you've got a kind of extra balance in the community. People know that you're ahead of the game, and they're going to take care of you. They're going to hey, he or she kicked down this year, so we know they're reliable. It means that you're a good, fully invested, reliable member of the community. And it also means that you've gotten rid of the surplus stuff that it's just going to rot or you're not going to use it. And you've used it to build goodwill in the economy. So it turns out that non-monetary economies almost always are gift economies where people just bring stuff and kind of put it into the pool, and everyone knows who's contributing and who isn't. And what happens after a while, if someone is kind of slacking for a little too long, then a group of people, a couple of people go over and talk to them and say, hey, what's the story? Have you been sick? Or, do you need some help? What's going on? We've noticed you haven't really been contributing. And if there's a problem, how can we help you? But these economies are small enough so everybody's aware of who's kicking down and who isn't. And once an economy gets big enough to where people are anonymous, you really lose that ability. So this is another reason for having small scale villages where people know one another. But the whole idea is here that really non-monetary economies are gift economies, where everything goes into kind of a common pool. And there even are mechanisms in these economies to avoid keeping track. So no one really is tallying up, well, you gave this much and you gave that much and it doesn't quite balance out. They actually have mechanisms where we're actually actively not really keeping track, but we just know if there is an imbalance because you know who these people are. They're your friends and they're your neighbors. So I really love this idea of gift economies as a way of doing a non-monetary economy, because it keeps things alive, it keeps things flowing, it creates bonds and ongoing living transactions between people. So how do we create a better kind of economy, of what I would call a regenerative economy? Because I think we have a degenerative economy right now. We've got money concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, which is the natural tendency of money. Those who have a lot get more. Those who don't have much, it's really hard for them to keep up. It's hard for them to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And what we've got in our economy right now is something called fractional reserve banking, which is where the banks, the idea is that there are a certain amount of deposits on hand in the banks to sort of back up the money that the banks lend out, or that, when you write a check, you're getting money from your checking account, except that really that money's not really there. It's just on paper. There isn't a pool of your money sitting somewhere. There's just an accounting being made, and banks are allowed to loan out vastly more money than they actually have, based on the idea that it's going to be really unusual for everyone to want all of their money all at once out of the bank. It really relies on this idea. But what the way that they can get away with this is because that fractional reserve banking is totally dependent on a growth economy. We know there's going to be more next year, so we can loan out more because we know that there'll be more coming in next year. And this is part of what feeds the whole infinite growth cycle, that the economy really would be in huge trouble if there weren't constant growth. And that is actually what has happened. There hasn't actually been much in the way of real growth in the economy, in any economy, truly since about the 1970s or so. There's just been juggling of accounts and exploiting lower labor costs in different countries, and a lot of borrowing from the future, a huge amount of borrowing from the future. So if we wanted to have a regenerative economy, it would need to be much more of a steady state economy. And that's really what a mature economy would look like, because everything stops growing after a while. You stop growing in size. I mean, there's other types of growth. There's emotional growth and spiritual growth and intellectual growth and those sorts of things. It's not like all forms of growth stop, but physical growth stops. And if we're living on a finite planet, and we certainly are, then you can't have an infinite economy. It's going to destroy the planetary ecosystems, and it's going to really damage the social systems as well. So we're looking for, what we're trying to do, a whole bunch of people are trying to move towards a steady state economy where the economy itself is not growing, and we're not having to work more and more hours every week, every year. We work just enough to pay the bills and make it all work, and then we have plenty of time for other activities. A really important part of this is to move away from this idea of fractional reserve banking, which is not tied to anything real, and to develop money systems that actually are tied to something real. It used to be tied to gold, and that would be one way to go back onto the gold standard. But people are coming up with a bunch of other ideas, and I want to look at a couple of those. Something called LET systems, and that acronym LETS means several different things, depending on who you talk to. But one of it is local economic trading system, but the L always stands for local. These are local currencies. These are monies that have been made up locally, and the idea is that it's not going to replace the national currency. It's not going to replace the pound or the euro or the dollar or the yen or anything like that. But it supplements it. And the idea with a LET system or a local currency is that it's going to encourage people to spend their money locally. So the way that these work, there are three different ways to do it. One is that the local currency is tied to the national currency. In other words, you have, $10 in, local bucks or something like that, and it's worth $10 in US dollars or Australian dollars or whatever. So it can be tied to the national currency. More commonly, they are tied to an amount of time or an amount of labor. And these are monetary systems that say, look, my time is worth exactly the same as your time. An hour of my life is worth the same as an hour of your life. So the idea that someone else should be paid, 5 times more per hour or 50 times more per hour for the same time's worth of work is what these systems are trying to get away from. The only time that someone might be given more per hour is if they're in a profession that has a huge amount of overhead, like medicine, where you've got offices and fancy equipment and things like that, where there really are larger costs. But for the most part, these systems are based on the idea that an hour of your time is exactly the same as an hour of my time. In this picture of this bill down here, I see things have gotten swapped around a little bit. An Ithaca hour. The Ithaca hour system is probably the oldest, longest lasting local currency system that there is. It's in Ithaca, New York, and a lot of local businesses participate in this. And usually you don't pay for everything in Ithaca hours. It's usually a mixture of US dollars plus the local hours. But you can see there's an 8th hour. And it's tied both to an hour, and then also you can trade it for money as well. Or in other cases, they tie it to a fixed basket of goods. And this is a pretty nice way to do it because it avoids inflation. They'll pick a basket of a certain amount of food or a certain amount of clothing and food and a mixture and things like that, and they'll say, this is what our currency is tied to. 1 unit of currency will get you this basket of goods. So there isn't, this automatically gets rid of inflation. And there's an outfit called the Schumacher Center for, I think it's just called the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I see I've covered it up here with this this picture. But if you want to know more about local currencies, there's a lot of information out there. They're really exciting. They're really cool things to do. And a lot of places are setting up local currencies. It really helps encourage local purchasing and supporting local businesses, but it doesn't replace the national currency. It just really supplements it. So just this whole idea of a job, it's actually a very recent idea, pretty much since the industrial age. I mean, if you look at non-industrial or non-agricultural societies, they don't have jobs. People do pretty much everything. Hunter-gatherers will, they'll sit around. A lot of their time is spent making stuff together. Most foragers, most hunter-gatherers can gather a week's worth of food in just a few hours of work. So, with their food needs taken care of, and they've already got their house built, and they've got their clothing, and their needs are usually fairly simple. So the rest of the time they just hang out, and so they'll make stuff together, weave things or carve things or make tools or do art. But they don't really have formal jobs. They're just making the things that they need. And then if you're in a real agricultural economy, farmers are really generalists. Like all the farmers that I know, they know how to fix tools, they know how to weld, they know how to build stuff, they know, they've got many, many, many different skills, so that they're very much generalists. But it was really the dawn of the industrial age that brought this specialization, where, for one thing, a lot of the rural jobs were pretty much eliminated. Like forestry, for example. People used to make a living in the woods, not just cutting down trees, but by gathering things, wildcrafting, gathering mushrooms, gathering small pieces of wood and making objects out of it, making fences, making medicine, making, wattle walls for building. There were dozens and dozens of jobs in the woods. And when the forests were rationalized, when all the undergrowth was cut down and tree farms were planted, all those jobs disappeared, because there were no mushrooms left in this forest. There were no small poles that people could use to build little things out of. And so all these people were displaced from the forest, and just coincidentally, all these industrial jobs were appearing. So people no longer had work out in the woods, out in the rural areas, and so they moved to cities to take factory jobs. So it was really the industrial era that created this specialization. And this really, made people much more dependent on someone else for their livelihood instead of for themselves. They really got a tremendous loss of self-reliance and also control over their lives. They were dependent on someone else to pay them, someone else to house them, and a lot of the skills that they had were very quickly lost. So that nowadays we have lots of people who can't really do anything except their job and maybe a hobby. But we don't know how to fix stuff. We don't know how to build stuff, other than if you're a particular type of craftsperson or hobbyist. So we really, I think of these things as two different things, as jobs or a living. And I'm much more interested in livelihood and in having a living rather than a job. I would frankly like to see really high unemployment, because it doesn't take that many hours to actually provide for yourself with basic needs, if you're really talking about just basic needs, particularly in an economy that's not full of inflation and craziness the way ours is. So that's a whole different story that I don't want to go into too much. There's, again, money stirs up all sorts of things, and we could have a big, long discussion about money. But I just want to introduce this idea of, are we talking about jobs, or are we talking about livelihoods and really having a decent living? So the workplace has gotten much more complex over the last, the last few centuries, where in non-industrial societies, the vast majority of people were farmers. There were a few merchants and tradespeople, and then a few, oligarchs, rulers, very few of those. But what happened when we came up with fossil fuel and really cheap energy was that these hierarchies got much, much steeper, and there became lots of room in the middle, all sorts of middlemen, all sorts of people, or middle people, or whatever the right word would be, all kinds of intermediaries, all sorts of people shipping things and packaging things and brokering things and loaning money and banking and and many more people doing teaching rather than just apprentices, lots and lots of services of all sorts of things needed to be repaired. So suddenly you've got all these layers and layers and layers of jobs that were in the middle that hadn't been there before. So much more complex workplace. And what's happening as energy costs start to rise is that all those middle jobs are really getting squeezed. And this is part of why we're seeing the disappearance of the middle class, is because as energy costs increase, there isn't the kind of slack, or there isn't the excess that makes it possible for all these middlemen or middle people to be able to make a living anymore. That the middle is kind of getting squeezed out. And in particular, people who have jobs that are really, that have a lot of complexity, global finance, higher education, the really advanced parts of healthcare, these are the systems that start to get squeezed first because they are so complex. And we're seeing this. We're seeing a breakdown in the healthcare system. We're seeing the financial system get really, really shaky. We're seeing higher education getting so expensive that, does it really make sense to get yourself several $100,000s in debt to go to college? Is that actually going to pay itself back? You'll be really indentured to your student debt for a very long time, and that may not make sense. It might make sense to just go out and get a job after high school. So these much more complex ways of making a living are starting to really get squeezed as energy costs go up, because the complexity is getting kind of squeezed out of our society as costs rise and as these really complicated systems are no longer supportable. So what do we do? When people learn about these things, and I say the first response to the crisis, and I mean crisis in many different ways. This means learning about peak oil, or learning about the way, the very fragile and tenuous nature of the economy, learning how much your student debt is going to be. There are all sorts of things, or if it's climate change, whatever it is, there's something out there that's going to freak you out. Something that you will consider a crisis and a real predicament, not just a problem, but something that can't really be solved. And it's interesting because the universal first response to when people learn about this, whatever the crisis is, peak oil or global collapse of some sort, is I got to move to the country, and I'm going to go buy my bunker, get my farmstead, my doomstead out in the country, and that is definitely a viable response. And if you're planning on doing that, I would do that now, because you don't want to be in the middle of a global collapse of some kind and, be competing with millions of other people trying to find some place out in the country, and then learning the skills necessary to be a real homesteader. I mean, there's easily a 5 to 10 year learning curve if you want to, become a homesteader. It takes growing food isn't too difficult, although it definitely takes a while to learn how to grow food, especially out in the country when there are all sorts of predators out there. That it's actually much harder to grow food out in the country than it is in the city, because you've got to deal with bear, which are just a real pain. They'll tear big fences down. You have to deal with deer and raccoons and skunks and porcupines and all sorts of critters that will attack your garden that don't necessarily exist in the city. I've had major garden failures out in rural areas when I've lived there, because there's so many critters that want my food. So if you're planning on moving to the country, do it now, do it ahead of time, avoid the rush, and learn, get ahead on the learning curve, because it's going to take you 5 to 10 years to get good at rural living. You don't want to be doing that while you're panicking and while the economy really is collapsing. So get out there and do it now. But then what a lot of people do is, once they realize, well, maybe it's not that feasible to move out to the country, or maybe they moved out to the country and they found, well, it's kind of lonely out here, or it's a lot of work to homestead, which it really is. I've done homesteading, and it's a lot of work. And you spend most of your time, if you're not growing food, then you're repairing things and building things. And it's a hard way to do it if you're doing it by yourself. So the second response for a lot of people is, I'm going to create a community, or I'm going to join a community. We're going to create an intentional community. And that's another viable approach. But over 95% of all intentional communities fail within the first 5 years. It's really hard to create a successful intentional community. Most of them don't make it. Part of the reason is that you could just walk away. If things get hard, and that's what happens in most intentional communities, is there gets to be a conflict of some sort, people get unhappy, and people can just walk because there is something to walk away to. They can go back to the city and, find a job there, or they can go back and move in with their parents, or, there's an escape. And the problem is that if we are in the middle of a real crisis of some sort, there isn't somewhere to go. You won't be able to walk away because there's nothing to walk away to. So you're just going to have to stick it out. You're going to have to actually resolve the problems in your community. But that's another really common response is, I'm going to create an intentional community, or I'm going to join an intentional community. And that's a wonderful thing to do. And I've spent time at a lot of intentional communities. I've never actually lived in one for any length of time, more than a couple of months, but I've done a lot of teaching in intentional communities and spent 3 weeks at a time in many different intentional communities. And when they're running well, they're amazing. They're fantastic. The problem is there aren't many that run well. There are a lot of failures. So really, to approach this from a permaculture point of view, rather than kind of doing a geographic and moving to the country, or having this dream that we're going to create an intentional community, I think of this as taking a design approach to livelihood. And this it makes me think of a really important permaculture principle, which is that if you have a really important function, then you should do it a bunch of different ways. Like if we're doing water conservation, you don't want to just have a drip irrigation system. I mean, that's going to help, but you also want to build the organic matter content in your soil. You want to put down mulch, because that'll help hold more water. The organic matter content in the soil will hold lots of water. You want to put down mulch to keep water from evaporating. You want to put in drought-tolerant plants, or at least plants that match the amount of water that you have, and on and on. You want multiple strategies for water conservation. And there probably isn't a function more important than livelihood. So if you're going to take a permaculture approach to livelihood, you want to support your livelihood in multiple ways, rather than just having one job that if it goes out from under you somehow, you get laid off, or something happens so you lose your job, you're in big trouble. So we want to develop multiple strategies for livelihood. That's the permaculture approach. So, all right, so let's take a look at that. So I've got this list here, and I'm going to go through each one individually, but I want to just show you this list of, that the first strategy would be to reduce consumption, because conserving something is the quickest way to create abundance. Rather than creating more, we become less dependent on it and use less. We want to make ourselves less dependent on money, find non-monetary ways of supporting ourselves. We want to develop skills that are valuable. Like I've said, we want to have multiple sources of income or of livelihood, which is a little different from income. We want something that will generate a surplus so that we can, gift the surplus or trade it or invest it. And we want that surplus to be able to feed back into our livelihood, to reinvest so that it continues to support us as well. So let's look at all those. Let's kind of unpack those and see what they mean. All right, so by reducing consumption, then, this is really boring and it's really basic, but keep a budget. It just, it feels very basic and it's not exactly exciting, but it really works. Just keep track of your expenses, keep track of what you're buying, obviously keep track of your income, that's pretty easy to do, but keep a budget so that you know what you're spending, because then you can figure out where you're bleeding away money unnecessarily, where your big expenses are, where the good leverage points are, where you could make a big change or a small change in your spending habits and get a lot of bang for that buck, get a lot of return for making a small change. You'll see where the good leverage points in your own personal economy are. You can identify what your biggest expenses are and then work on those. You can figure out what expenses you have that are optional, that are discretionary, okay, here are the places where I could trim the fat, or if I needed to, I could get rid of this one. And also you could find the things that are going to be easiest to change. And those are often good places to start, because when you're creating a budget and you're trying to save money and you're trying to spend less money, and you're trying to reduce the need to earn, what you don't want to do is make yourself miserable right off the bat, because you won't stick to it. So find easy places to make changes. Find something that would be easy to give up, or easy to find a cheaper way to do it, or find the easy places rather than go after the hard ones first. Rather than, okay, well, rent's a big expense, so I'm going to move into a tiny little apartment, even though we'll be cramped and crowded and not very happy. That might not be a good approach, because it's a hard one, and it's going to impact your quality of life. So keeping a budget will help you identify the places that are going to be easy to change, that aren't going to make you feel bad. And I want to point out a couple. There are many, many good resources here, but two resources that I've used that have really made a big difference in my life. A book that came out, I believe, in the 1980s, called Your Money or Your Life, by a fellow who has unfortunately passed away, Joe Dominguez, and a wonderful woman named Vicki Robin, who's gone on to write several other wonderful books. And it really literally is about your money or your life. The book makes the point that you are trading your life energy for money. And so how much of that do you want to do? And the original program of the book was to become financially independent, to really keep track of all the money that you were spending and all your income, and figure out, the question that they wanted you to ask with every single expense is this getting me toward my goal, my financial goal? And their financial goal in the original version of the book was financial independence. Their idea was to save up enough money so that you could earn, so that money would then generate an income for you, and you could essentially retire. And I know a bunch of people who followed this program and who actually did, within 5 to 10 years, have enough money to retire, have enough saved up so that they could then live off of the earnings of it. And they definitely worked hard at it. They definitely economized tremendously, just really rigorously just said, is this expense getting me towards my goal of financial independence? Is going to this restaurant, is buying this piece of clothing, is taking this vacation going to get me closer to that? And that sounds like an austerity program, and it was, but if you're motivated by that goal of, imagine, in 6 years, I could be totally financially independent and I wouldn't need a job anymore. And so that was one part of their program. And another part of their program was, if you didn't need money, what would you do? And then try and find that job, essentially. And then, find a job that, maybe wouldn't pay you as much, but that you could then take once you did have a fair amount of money saved up, so that you could be doing something you really enjoyed doing, still get a bit of an income from it. But their question was, if you didn't need money, would you still be doing this job? And then, well, what job would you have if you didn't need money? What would you be doing with your time? Because most people aren't going to lie on a beach for very long. They might spend a little bit of time doing that, but most of us really do like to keep busy. Most of us like to do things. So Your Money or Your Life, I actually used as a roadmap for a number of years, and I didn't follow it to financial independence, but I learned a lot from it. And I still frame a lot of my purchases in terms of, is this getting me further towards my goals or not? And then another really wonderful book, just how to think about money in different ways, is called Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein. And Charles he's walking his talk. He has the book up on his website as a free download. So, you can make a donation, but on that really is walking your talk, as he's giving this book away, and he's become pretty well known for what he's done. But he's really, the point of this book is, how do we develop a much more sacred relationship with money, rather than this kind of sick relationship with money that we have right now. All right. So if we're developing multiple strategies, then we want to find non-monetary ways of support. Then how can, we'll need some money, but how can we have ourselves supported not just by money all the time? Because one of the things that's happened particularly over the last 30 years or so, as true growth in the economy has slowed and pretty much almost stopped. The financial industry has been looking for ways to turn more and more things into money. If you can't actually grow the economy through having more stuff, and extracting stuff has just become very expensive and very difficult, they've been finding more ways to make you pay for things that used to be free. And you can think of a perfect example for me is childcare and elder care. That if you look at traditional societies or even our own Western culture 50 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, elders were taken care of by their children. You left the home when you became an adult, and you earned a living for a while, and then when your parents became elderly, your parents moved back in with you, and they took care of your kids. So that, because by then your kids were, old enough to where, you wanted to go to work, daycare didn't exist, your parents lived with you, so you didn't have to pay for elder care, and you didn't have to pay for daycare. So by keeping the extended family together, you saved huge amounts of money. And what happened in the 70s and 80s or so is these systems were broken apart. We were all taught that, oh, you don't want your parents living with you. That's a terrible thing to have happen. And so the parents moved into a nursing home or some sort of assisted living center or something that cost a ton of money. And actually, my wife is right now looking at some sort of elder care system for her mom, and holy cow, is it expensive. So we're trying to figure out some different way of doing it. But what this did was take something that was free, elder care and child care, and suddenly make it pay on both ends, so that the wage earner people in young middle age were then paying to keep their parents in some sort of a living situation and paying daycare for their kids. So this is just one of hundreds of ways that things have been monetized. Hobbies used to be essentially free. Now you got to buy all the expensive gear and the right clothes and all kinds of things like that. There's just nearly everything has been monetized. In other words, everything's been turned into a commodity. And we have kind of the choice of, do you want commodities or do you want community? Because having community is a tremendous way to save money. When you've got friends to help you, when you can have work parties, when you can share tools with one another, when you can trade skills with one another, when you can teach one another rather than having to take classes, a community will save you a huge amount of money. And the same with this idea of trading with friends and family. And even these days now with the internet, their virtual communities become resources as well. But, I've learned a huge amount and gotten all sorts of skills and free things as well off of the internet. There are all these great websites, FreeCycle and Craigslist and things where you can find incredible bargains. So there's lots of ways that the internet can help us save money as well. So there are virtual communities as well as our live ones become resources. And again, it's just this whole idea of, we're not necessarily using less money, but we're using money less. We're just less reliant on it. And I think in general, relying on technology increases the amount of money that we need, whereas relying on natural things and on community tends to decrease the amount of money. And so I want to later on talk about the 8 forms of capital as a way to greatly reduce the amount of reliance that we have on money, the financial capital, by placing much more reliance on other forms of capital. So we're looking at finding non-monetary ways of support. Then another strategy would be to develop valuable skills. And this is this idea that if you value something, the chances are that you are not the only person in the world who values that. So if you develop a skill, if you develop a way of doing something, a hobby or a craft or an ability to make something, create something, write something, build something, something creative, the chances are that somebody out there is probably going to want to support you in doing it, or a few people may want to support you in doing it. So this just you can be pointed right towards sources of income just by what do you love doing. I'll bet there's a job in there somewhere, because you're probably not the only person who appreciates those sorts of things, whatever that might happen to be. So, it's a little bit like following your bliss. Do something that you really love doing, and the money will probably follow. A really important part here is that in a contracting economy, you want to have a strong claim to your livelihood. In other words, you don't want to be one of these middle-level employees, because those are the ones who get squeezed out the first. The people who are actually down on the shop floor making stuff, as long as their job doesn't get outsourced, which it certainly can, but as long as that doesn't happen, those people who are actually physically making things actually have a pretty strong claim to their job. If you're doing skilled labor, you are liable to be one of the last people to be fired unless they ship the whole place overseas or something like that. But the people who are down on the shop floor and the owners are the two people who have the strongest claim to their job. The people in the middle, the sales force, the marketing force, the intermediaries, the personnel officers, all of those people, the accountants, the budget people, all those folks in the middle don't have a very strong claim to their livelihood, and those are the people who are going to get knocked out first. So you want, essentially, this is a good argument for being an entrepreneur, or to work closely with one that you trust, so that you have a good, strong claim to your job, or you're working with someone who has a strong claim and who's liable to keep you at your job, someone that you trust and someone who wants to see you do well. And I think this is part of why we're seeing this huge rise in entrepreneurs, is because it's a way to have a strong claim to your job. And then another important piece is to supply basic needs. What are the real basics? If you want to move away from the esoteric stuff, or these middle level positions that I think are getting squeezed out, then you look at what basic human needs are and how can you support those. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the idea is, be of value. Do something that makes you of value. Just like in the gift economy, people will look at you and go, "Oh yeah, they're kicking down. They're helping out. They play a valuable role in our community. So we're going to support them. They're having a hard time this year, so we'll carry them through, because once they're over their hard time, they're going to be just fine, and they'll start contributing again." So I want to develop valuable skills. And then this idea of multiple sources of livelihood. There was a great set of books by an electronics tinkerer in the 1970s, this guy named Don Lancaster, who was just an electronic hobbyist, basically. But he would build all these cool little machines. He worked on early computers and things like that. And he patented a bunch of very small things. None of them was going to make him rich. But each one generated a little bit of income, and he called these nickel generators. I think these days with inflation, you probably have to call them dollar generators or something. But no one of them was going to support him completely. But by having 10 or 12 of these little nickel generators, enough money came in from all of them to take care of him, to cover most of his expenses. And then if one of them happened to hit, suddenly one got successful, then he was in great shape. So by having multiple sources of income, no one of which was enough to support you completely, but all together they took care of you, you then became a lot more secure financially. You had multiple sources of income, and it would be very rare if they all failed all at once, or even if most of them failed. Then there's this whole idea of micro enterprise and micro loans. It turns out that there are at least 20 million people in the United States who have what you call micro enterprises. I certainly do. My job teaching and writing about permaculture and doing a little bit of design work, that's very definitely a micro enterprise. I'm an entrepreneur, and I don't need an awful lot of money, but the skills that I have do generate enough for me. And then there's something, so lots and lots of people are doing that. They have small jobs that are independent, 20 million in the US at least. Then there's something called income patching, where A person will have a part-time job, but most of us know that part-time jobs are not going to make ends meet completely. So then they have some sort of micro enterprise on top of that at the same time. Some little gig going that supports their part-time job. And then there's the idea of building synergies between what you do and what other people are doing. And I like to think of these as business guilds, where often business people think of other businesses as competitors, but thinking of them as collaborators somehow. Like in a plant guild, what you've got is a bunch of plants that support one another. In other words, this plant attracts beneficial insects, and this plant builds fertility, and that helps all the other plants. And this plant makes mulch, and that helps all the other plants. So think of businesses that are like that, where the products of one business can go become, an important resource for another business. And I remember there was, when I lived in Portland, Oregon, there was a really cool setup where there was a cafe down the street from me, and it was a breakfast and lunch place. And they were world renowned, or at least locally renowned, for their soups. They made really delicious soups and pretty good sandwiches. And up the street, this bagel shop opened up, and the bagel shop decided that they wanted to have sandwiches too, but they also wanted to sell soup. And so they worked out a deal where they would provide bagels to the breakfast and lunch place in exchange for soup, because it was far enough away so that it was close, but it was far enough away so that their markets were a little bit different. They didn't, draw off of the exact same clientele. So the breakfast and lunch place would supply soup, and in exchange, they got bagels, which they could use to make their sandwiches with. The breakfast and lunch place was right next door to a pretty fancy dinner restaurant. And the dinner restaurant had this beautiful outdoor patio, but they didn't use it for breakfast and lunch because it was a dinner restaurant. So the breakfast and lunch place made a deal where they would provide, you guessed it, soups to the dinner place and some various other little services in exchange for use of this really lovely patio during breakfast and lunch. Didn't cost them anything, but they, in other words, this is the creation of a business guild. Then a couple miles away, there was the cheese shop that wanted to open up a little lunch stand, and the cheese shop set up a deal with the breakfast and lunch place where they would provide cheese, and in exchange they would get soups and sandwiches. So these 4 or 5 businesses all work together. Normally they would think of themselves as competitors, right? I mean, they're all restaurants, so of course they're in competition with one another, but they weren't. They were all helping one another by surpluses from one becoming a really useful and essentially free resource for the other businesses. So this is what you can come up with, is this idea of business guilds, where the businesses are interacting with one another and supporting one another just the way plant guilds are. So you can take this idea that we've got now of plant guilds and port it over into Livelihood so that we can now have business guilds that reduce our need to spend money to grow our business, and that create these really nice collaborations. These businesses could advertise for one another. I mean, there's just, it's total win-win. Lots and lots of really, really good synergies here. And then this last piece here, start small and grow by chunking. I want to give you an example of just what that means. So there was, here we go. One of the things that happens in a lot of cities is something called a food desert, where that's officially defined as a place where there is no place to get healthy food within a quarter mile. That the only food available, if there's any, would be fast food, or like tacos at a local, at a corner store, industrial made, microwavable food, something like that. So junk food. Or no food at all. And there are a lot of urban areas that have food deserts. There was a food desert in a neighborhood in Oakland, California, where a group of the people who lived there said, we're tired of this. We want to get a food store in here. So they went to some of the major food stores and said, we want you to open a food store in our neighborhood. And, the big stores did a little market research and said, nah, we can't make it in your neighborhood. So the folks got together in the neighborhood and said, well, then we'll start our own. We'll create a food store. And then when they got to thinking about it, they thought, well, we've never run a food store before. We don't have the capital. It's going to cost a lot of money to get started. We don't know what we're doing. there's a really good chance that we'd fail, that we'd borrow a whole bunch of money, go into debt, and then the store would fail because we don't know if there's a good market in our neighborhood. So what they did instead, they still wanted to bring food into their neighborhood. So they bought a used delivery truck and they painted it really cool. And they went around to some food wholesalers and were able to get sometimes day-old stuff, sometimes good fresh things. But they got a whole bunch of produce and loaded it up in the truck. And then they would drive to places like senior centers, community centers, and sometimes near schools and near hotels and things like that, and just set up they call this the mobile market, and then sell food from the truck. And it worked out really, really well. And it was so successful, actually, that they ended up buying a second one. And this went on for several years. Just this terrifically successful mobile market that was going on. And it got so popular and so successful in the neighborhood that, let's see, there we go. A bunch of vacant lots in the neighborhood, people took them over and started growing produce for the mobile market. So now they had all this free food that their neighbors were providing for them, and the people who provided the food would often get finished goods in return for trading stuff to them. So that reduced their expenses even more. And then eventually, very strange. There we go. So eventually they were able to save up enough money so that they now are in the process of buying an actual storefront and getting it built. It's going to be the People's Grocery in a neighborhood in Oakland that used to be a food desert. But what they did was they started small and they put together small chunks that were working. The mobile market was just this small piece that worked well, and they replicated it with a second mobile market, and they learned the in and outs of running a business, and they learned about the food industry, and they learned about retail sales, and they learned all this stuff, and they saved a bunch of capital, and then they figured out enough of what they were doing, and then they broke into the whole storefront idea. But it was a much more intelligent and guaranteed way to have a food business than if they'd just gone out and got millions of dollars in debt buying a storefront when they don't even know if it's going to be successful. So this idea of starting small, getting successful at a small scale, replicating your successes, and then combining them to create something bigger. Start small and grow by chunking. And you can do this with your business. It's a really good, again, permaculture technique for a safe way to generate livelihood. Okay, so another important piece of designing a secure livelihood is to generate a surplus and then reinvest that surplus back into the business to support that livelihood or whatever it is. Because every system, whether it's a forest or a business or a household, it needs reserves. It needs to have buffers. It needs to have a little bit of stuff stored up for a rainy day. And almost all businesses generate some sort of a surplus. You notice that if you're in business for yourself, whatever it is you're selling, you tend to have some extra of. I certainly noticed that when I was, in the different kinds of businesses that I've had when I was younger. I'd always have excess inventory that then you can trade to take care of other needs. And that surplus also can be used to build different forms of capital. You give away some of your surplus to your neighbors, and now you've got goodwill. You've got social capital in your neighborhood. So generating a surplus and then figuring out useful and helpful things to do with that surplus, whether you save some of it yourself or whether you use it to generate goodwill and other forms of, of kind of what we call capital, other than financial capital in our lives. So I want to go into this idea of the 8 forms of capital. This is, we all know about financial capital, right? That's the most common form of capital. That's down there at the bottom. So I want to give credit to these two fellows in the Eastern U.S., Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landua, and their website they have one, appleseedpermaculture.com, but I'm surprised it's not on here. Their website is 8forms.com, just the numeral 8forms.com. And they also have a book out called Regenerative Enterprise. But, okay, so we all know what financial capital is. And the idea is that, you save up enough money until, you're 65 or 70 or whatever it is. And now you've got enough money saved up so that it'll generate interest and support you. You can retire. And that's pretty much a pipe dream these days, with financial markets being so volatile, and you never know when your investments are going to get wiped out, that it just, unless you have a really high paying job or are really fortunate or happen to be, in the right place at the right time in a startup or something, that just isn't, it's not a reliable way to do it anymore. So these guys talk about a bunch of other forms of capital. One of them that I think a lot of us are familiar with now is social capital, over there on the middle right. This actually was a term created by an amazing woman named Jane Jacobs, who was an urban activist in New York City. And there's a whole story about Jane. She's a terrific woman and did amazing work. But just the idea that our friends will get us through hard times probably better than money will. That I would rather depend on my friendships than on Wall Street, essentially, to get me through a hard time. So social capital is something that I think it's become part of our lexicon now. I think most of us know what social capital is. Then let's go clockwise around the wheel here from social capital. We've got material capital, and those are the things that we have. In other words, the tools that we've got and the things that we own, our home, if we own, are in the process of buying a house from a bank, the things that we own outright, our stuff, in other words, that's material capital. And that can support us, the tools that we've got, if your house is paid for, if your car is paid for, things like that. Once these things are paid for, they can reduce our need to spend money on them. So all of these forms of capital, what they're doing is they're reducing our dependence on money. Then financial capital we've talked about. Then living capital would be plants and animals, all the living stuff on the earth, which certainly supports us. It's where food comes from. It's where raw materials come from. So we've got living capital as we build up living capital, that takes care of us. It reduces our need to earn. It reduces our dependence on money because we've got food coming in, we've got, timber coming in, we've got craft materials coming in, things like that. Then cultural capital is the collective knowledge that our culture has, the things that we rely on, that kind of security that you get from the cultural wisdom. Hopefully we live in cultures that have some wisdom. Sometimes I'm not too sure about Western culture, but there is some culture capital, particularly in older, more traditional cultures. There's a lot to rely on there, and our cultural capital can make us a great deal less dependent on money. Just the ways that our culture can take care of us and the kind of security that gives us. Then there's experiential capital, the things that we've learned how to do, the experience that we've had, and the stuff that we know, essentially, the skills that we've got. Then intellectual capital would be the things that we've learned, the intellectual skills, and these we can use to either generate income or again to make us less dependent on money. We get smart and figure out how to need less money. Balancing our budget and things like that, using our intellectual capital. And then spiritual capital certainly helps us through hard times. And again, can teach us about the importance of being less dependent on money. That's one of the nice things about a spiritual practice, is that you realize that there are much more important things in life than money when you have a good, strong spiritual practice in your life. So the idea is that there are all these interactions between these 8 forms of capital, and each one of them greatly reduces our reliance on financial capital. As we build up these other forms of capital, then we become much less reliant on financial capital. And the other forms of capital then get stronger as well. When we loan somebody something, when we take something from our material capital and we loan it to them, or we teach something to somebody based on our experiential capital or our intellectual capital, all of a sudden we've built up social capital. We may have built up financial capital because maybe they'll pay us for doing that. We've built up cultural capital because we've now got a little bit of a tradition of helping one another in our culture. So every time you use one of these other forms of capital, it can make us much less dependent on financial capital. And that's really the whole point of these 8 forms is how do we kind of spread out the capital around us so that we're not as dependent on money, on financial capital, and that other things will support us as we decide that we don't want to be as reliant on money. And these are just a couple of graphics that I'm going to leave with you of the different ways that the 8 forms of capital work. And I'm not going to spend any time on these today, but you're welcome to take a look at these, or I would recommend going to their the website, 8forms.com, might be .org. But if you just Google 8 forms of capital, you'll get their website and just how these different types of capitals work with one another and how they interact. My goodness, there we go. And each one of these then has its own kind of currency. Like with social capital, the currency is the personal connections you have. With material capital, the currency is the material itself, and then natural resources. Financial capital, obviously, the currency is money. And living capital would be the stuff of life, the various elements, and so on, like that. And then the things that they create, they talk about complexing too. In other words, the things that these currencies and capitals then create when they're out there working. So I really am impressed with this whole line of thinking, and I'm using it a lot to help reduce my own need to earn. All right, and just as a nice example of a place that's using these 8 forms of capital is a place in Denver called the Grow House, which is it started out as a set of 5 or so abandoned greenhouses. They were abandoned years ago when they were cut flower greenhouses, but the cut flower industry moved down to Mexico and other places, and these greenhouses became abandoned. And there was a local developer who'd made a lot of money creating very fancy restaurants and high-end developments and things like that. And he decided it was time to give something back to the community. So he bought these greenhouses and he created a nonprofit where they grew a whole bunch of food in these greenhouses. They set up this amazing large-scale aquaponics system and this incredible heating system as well. This it's called a climate battery greenhouse, where it's much less reliant on fossil fuels to keep the greenhouse warm. That's a whole different story. But they produce a huge amount of food. And then they have a storefront and a farmer's market in the storefront. And the farmer's market is a pay-what-you-can store for anyone who lives in the neighborhood. You show your ID showing that you live in the neighborhood. The neighborhood is very low income. It's ethnically quite diverse. It's a former industrial site, so it's a brownfield. The soil is really toxic, so you don't want to be growing food there yourself. And it's a definitely underprivileged, very impoverished neighborhood. And so it turns out that this pay-as-you-go farmers market works just fine. People really do pay what you can. They do pay what they can. It's supporting itself. But it isn't just a farmers market. It's a job training center as well, because so many people from the neighborhood come into it that they get folks from the city and the state to come down and teach people about job opportunities. They teach English as a second language. They have all sorts of trainings for people. They help set people up with daycare. It's become the hub of the neighborhood because there are all these programs that go on there. And although food was kind of the foundation of it, which is really cool. I mean, that's how a lot of these things work. You start with food, and then all these other things come along with it. But it's really become the heart of the neighborhood, and it's really enlivened this neighborhood and given people hope. And there are people who work there at the greenhouses, local folks who work at the greenhouse. They teach a lot of classes there. It's just become this amazing place, and you can really see the 8 forms of capital at work there. It's not just financial capital, but there's social capital and cultural capital and material capital, and all the different forms of capital are really at work here. So to me, it's a beautiful example of the 8 forms of capital all working together to create something that isn't just about money. All right, so I'm trying to make the point here. One of them is, we're talking about livelihood, or what I like to think of as right livelihood, is that this idea of following your bliss actually works. Like I have told a little bit about my own personal story, but I started out as a scientist, and I did genetics research for close to 20 years or so. And I was an okay scientist, but I was never going to be a great scientist. I just don't have the type of mind. And I was working with some really great scientists. I mean, I was working with rock star scientists, some Nobel Prize winners, and people who'd made really important contributions to immunology and cancer research. And I was kind of awed by how brilliant these people were. And I realized, I'm never going to be one of these folks. I'm not, and I really had, I was looking for something else. I was looking for something where I really could, or that I could get really good at, something that I really did have a knack for. And when I discovered permaculture, just by playing hooky for my biotech job one day as a genetics researcher, I was playing hooky in the Seattle Public Library, looking up books on homesteading, because my wife and I had just bought 5 acres out in the country, and we were moving out to the country. And I pulled down this great big black book that I'd never seen before in the homesteading section. It was called Permaculture, a Designer's Manual, and started leafing through it and just said, wow, this is okay. We got food, we got energy, we got shelter, we got earthworks, we got water, we got climate, we got trees, we got a little bit about livelihood and community and economics, and it's about design, and it's about patterns. That's really cool. I just thought, well, these are all the different things that I've always been interested in my whole life, but I've never seen how they fit together. I always thought I was some weird guy with a bunch of eclectic interests that were totally unrelated. And permaculture and Bill Mollison showed me how they all fit together. And essentially, I quit my job and never looked back. It was like, this is what I'm meant to do. And I'd known from when I was a kid that ecology and nature and natural systems and whole systems were really what I was good at. But I got pulled into molecular biology as a sort of sexy, impressive way to make a living. There were a lot of high-paying jobs, and it was something that my parents would say, well, my son's a molecular biologist. Isn't that impressive? Rather than, well, my son's a kind of a hippie permaculturist. Isn't that not impressive? And eventually, I got over that, and and realized that permaculture was something I could get good at, and I did. I found the thing in life that I really love. And it's been more than 20 years, and I have, it's going on 25. I never looked back, and it's worked. I mean, I've got a successful book, and I love what I do, and I'm incredibly happy, and I'm supported by it. And, it's a case where I really did just let myself do what I knew I loved. And yeah, there were some lean years in there. There definitely were when I was getting started. It was tough for a while, and I went through a lot of my savings and, all that kind of thing. But I knew it was going to work because I knew that I loved it, and I knew that I could get good at it. So I just want to say that following your bliss actually works. There are safer ways to do it than others. I really just sort of, jumped into the deep end. But, take it from me. It really works. And so it's a way to tell, is if it's working, is to be paying attention. Are you increasing abundance around you, or are you getting feelings of scarcity? Like what in your life, are you feeling like there's a lot of scarcity, or are you feeling like there's more abundance in your life? That's a really important piece of feedback. And if you feel like things are scarce and it's scary out there and there's not enough to go around, there's probably a change that needs to be made. And there's a really great quote that Bill Mollison said, because someone asked him, so how do you know? How do you know whether you're on the right track, if you're doing the right thing? And Bill said that a really good sign is if resources are gathering around you. That's a sign that you're on the right track. So if good things continue to happen, if abundance keeps showing up in your life, that's a sign that you're on the right track. So these are just some things that I've learned. So pay attention, get that feedback. Okay, so just to recap what I've gone through here about designing a secure livelihood, here's the list again, and this idea of developing valuable skills, and probably someone else will value them. So I want to spend a little bit of time now on just, what can we do with our yards then, to go back to this, to go back to the visible structures thing, is how can we get income and resources actually from our yard, now that we have this kind of whole philosophy of livelihood, and it's permaculture informed livelihood way of thinking. You can grow all sorts of stuff, right? And it's nice to think about things that are going to have a little bit of higher value rather than just vegetables. So seeds are something that have quite a bit of value to them, as do herbs. You can propagate plants from cuttings and then sell the plants. Something that's always in high demand is perennial vegetable starts. People are always asking, where do I get mashua? Where do I get perennial kale? Where do I get, these sorts of things? So become a supplier of some of those perennial vegetable starts. Of course, you have to get the perennial vegetable starts from somewhere yourself. But these are ways to sell things out of your yard that actually can generate more income than $1 a pound for zucchini or something like that. You can get a pretty decent hourly wage by these sorts of higher value crops coming out of your yard. Then there's the idea of ethnobotanical plants. In other words, plants that have indigenous uses, sacred plants of different sorts. There's a business that's near me. They've been around for a long time. They've changed their name a couple times, and they're currently called Sacred Succulents. But they have this wonderful catalog full of all sorts of ethnobotanical plants from all over the world. And they're able to get a premium because these are plants that are used shamanically in different places, or plants that have just unusual properties. Plants that you would think of as kind of sacred plants, or plants that are used by various different indigenous cultures. And they do a pretty nice business on raising these. And I love going over and taking a look at their nursery, because they've got some really wild stuff there. It's really lots of fun. If you have a greenhouse, you can grow out of season stuff that would bring a much higher value, as well as you can grow tropical fruits. I know people who are growing papayas in their greenhouse, and they get a nice premium for them. Locally grown papayas. That's pretty cool in a cooler, temperate climate. So if you've got a greenhouse, you can do out of season or tropical stuff. I know people who are selling compost, particularly in urban areas. I know folks who get, for a 5-gallon bucket of compost, they get $25. I saw someone in New York City who had a coffee cup, a styrofoam coffee cup full of compost, and they were selling them for $2 off of their bicycle. And people were buying them, a little cup of compost that people would take home and put on their flowering plants, on their potted plants in their house. So yes, you can actually sell compost if you're generating enough of it. Then if you're doing aquaponics, you can sell fish or other things that you're growing in the aquaponics tank, because these will bring in quite a bit more money than just plain old vegetables. And then the microgreen market is kind of saturated, salad greens and things like that. There's so many people doing this now, but you may be able to develop a relationship with a restaurant and sell microgreens. You need to have a good system down. You need to be really good at it, and you need to have some buyers who will take it off your hands as soon as it's ready. And then you can also raise bees, and you can sell honey, or you can get the bees will store pollen for you, and you can raid the hive and get the pollen and sell that. Or there's something that bees make called propolis, which is a sort of a gel-like substance that has been shown to have all sorts of immune-boosting properties. So there are multiple products that beehives can provide for you besides just honey. So those are some things that you can grow in your yard and get some income straight from your yard. But I would also recommend value-added products, and we talked about some of these last week. The idea of not just raw materials, but things that you put a little bit of labor into so that you can get a higher price for them. And here are just some lists, obviously jams and jellies and salves and tinctures and things like that. I know a couple people who have greenhouses, and they've been growing incense-type plants, frankincense and myrrh and things like that. They take a while to get going. You got to have them for a few years before the resins become available. But that's something you can do in a greenhouse, is grow plants that you can get incense from, and these actually you can sell for quite a bit of money. $10 an ounce or so for incense. So that's one possibility. And then there's the prepared foods like fermented things, sauerkrauts and kimchi, those sorts of things. Also preparing ready-to-eat foods because people are just on the go all the time. Juices and broths I'd mentioned before as a product that people sell in our local farmers market. And then if you've got a big enough yard, you can generate basketry weaving things, so you can make baskets, something called a hurdle, which is like a little fence that's woven together, and you can use them as screens or animal barriers around the yard. Same with a wattle wall, which is just a wall of uprights with willow branches and things like that woven in between the uprights, or little sections of fence, things like that. And then also charcoal and biochar. I actually have a friend who has a deal with some Japanese people who want very beautiful, twisted, ornate little twigs that have been made into charcoal that still preserve the shape of the twig. And you particularly get a premium if on the end of the twig there's this little star pattern from where it's checked and cracked. And he will get like $25 for one little charcoal twig that then he ships over to Japan, and they use it in their tea ceremony. They'll put it on a special burner and have this one beautiful little twig, charcoal twig, that they'll use in the tea ceremony. So you can actually sell raw charcoal. So if you don't have a big yard, you might be able to get a market like that where one twig for $25 or whatever. Or biochar as well, where you might be able to grow enough wood in your yard to make small amounts of twig type biochar, or maybe you can just come up with scrap wood from places and make biochar as well, because biochar is quite expensive. You can get a nice little sum for doing biochar. So, all right, but let's say that you don't really want to sell stuff out of your yard itself. You don't want to actually be producing products. Well, there are all sorts of things that you can do with your yard. You can rent out a shed in your yard. You can build, if you live in a place that allows it, an additional dwelling unit or a grandmother cottage, that sort of a granny unit. Or you can rent out storage spaces if you have, a large driveway or a garage or something. You can store a boat or an RV there for, $50, $75 a month or so. You can also, if you've got a particularly beautiful garden, you can rent out the garden for various events, weddings, or someone can come by and do a class in your garden. You can also use your yard for little pop-up parties. You don't even really need a permit for things like that because it'll just show up and be there and then be gone. But I know someone who has done a lot of tea parties. They actually built this temporary structure and would have really fun little, they call them tea parties, but there are a lot of different things, music and all sorts of things going on. Also, movable restaurants. If you are a chef or if you know someone who is, you can have a little dinner seating out in your yard or in your house and bring in some income that way. Or just, pop up music, poetry slams, just all sorts of little things that you can have at your yard, kind of get people to pay to come and use it. And then this photo here is just to get the idea across that if you don't have an actual room to rent out in your house, or maybe you already are doing an Airbnb thing, for people who want a little bit more of a rustic experience, you can have a platform with some sort of a heater or stove in it, and then a really elegant tent of some sort, beautifully decorated, and you can rent that out as an Airbnb unit. So there are lots of things that you can get additional income from your yard. Really, again, the greatest limit to abundance is the designer's imagination. That's a very important permaculture principle, is that you will run out of ideas before you actually will have maximized the number of yields that you can get. So the idea is that we're going around the permaculture flower and we're looking at all the other needs that are there. Food is definitely one of them, but there a bunch of basic human needs. And I think of this as the permaculture flower. David Holmgren came up with the idea, the co-founder of permaculture. And this is my own version of the permaculture flower, where we kind of go around the wheel on the personal level, the local level, and also the regional level. And we think of, all right, how do we meet our food needs, energy needs, water, shelter, waste, health, spirit, community, justice, and livelihood. All of these are basic human needs, and there may be a few more that you could stick in there, but these are the ones that struck me as, and we meet these needs on the personal level, on the local level, and on the regional level. And I bet if we took a census from everybody taking this course, that everyone here would have a place on this wheel at the personal or the local or the regional. Maybe there's someone here who's working on local justice issues, and there's someone else who's working on regional waste issues. But I bet we could fill up this permaculture flower with everyone in this class and meet all of our needs. I mean, all the folks taking this class could become a village where we've met each other's needs completely. So the idea is to, where on the wheel do you fit? What needs would you like to take care of? Because that's a way to think of as earning a livelihood, is by taking care of a basic human need. There's a job there. There's a livelihood there. So, it comes back to this idea that if you love doing something or creating something, the chances are that you are not the only person in the world who values that. So we go around the permaculture flower, what are those basic needs? So, as far as water is concerned, maybe you can do water harvesting, set up water harvesting systems for people, or irrigation systems. Maybe you can show people how to build rocket stoves and heating stoves and masonry stoves, or build greenhouses for folks, or do energy retrofits if you're talking about the energy systems for people. More energy would be solar and wind and other forms of energy, microhydro installation, if that's something you're interested in. Or if we're looking at waste systems, gray water, also black water, which would be toilet waste, or if we're not using water, then composting toilets, either legal ones or ones that are off the radar. And then the whole health field of healing, herbalism, different forms of healthcare. That maybe that's someplace that you feel you fit along the wheel, or just the spiritual guidance, counseling, and things like that, or the possibility of helping people with negotiation and facilitation and mediation. If you're if you're oriented in that way, if you're a skillful mediator of some kind. Or just coaching and job training, helping people making a transition. You've made these transitions yourself, so you can help others do that. But it really is about following your bliss. What are you good at? What do you love doing? And then sharing that experience. That's a lesson that I've learned in my life, and I think it's a really important one that that we really want to pay attention to, because this is true job security: is finding something you love doing, getting a good, strong claim towards doing it by being an entrepreneur or working with someone that you really trust, and doing something that is going to be of value, something that meets a basic need really directly. That, for me, is the key to good livelihood. Have this idea of having a strong claim by being either self-employed or being a key employee for someone who you trust and who feels that your work is really valuable. All right, so that has taken us through lesson 5, and I want to get you the homework assignment for this time to work on your design project. The idea here is that I want to be able to help all of you make some progress on designing, either your yard or some place that you are designing. So it may take me a little while to get through everyone, because I want to spend some real time working with each one of these designs. But what I want folks to do is, you created a base map last time, or that was your homework assignment. So those of you who haven't handed it in can be working on that. And then create an overlay, either a transparency or another layer in a graphics program or whatever it is. But just tracing paper, something that goes on, or you can make a copy of your base map and draw this right on the base map. But something that then what is your design going to be? Where are the major access paths in it? What are the major plantings? If you want to list different species and things, you can do that. But just where where kind of is your zone 1 and your zone 2 planting areas? What have you got going on there? Where do the major garden beds go? Are you going to be putting any guilds in? You've already given me those guild ideas were really good, and I really appreciated them. There were some superb ones there. So, have you got guilds that you want to incorporate? Then, are you going to have animals in your design? You're going to be doing chickens or bees or rabbits or anything like that. You don't have to, but if you're doing animals, then where would they be located in the design? And then anything else, you can make it as complex or as simple as you want. And then I will, over the next couple of weeks, like I say, it may take me a little while because I really do want to do a careful job. One thing I want to let folks know is I know some of you have had trouble uploading the homework assignments, and I have about 5 or 6 homeworks that people have sent me that are blank. And I have a feeling that people think they've submitted something because they submitted it, but there are about 5 or 6 of them that came to me blank. Nothing is on them. So if you have not gotten, I think I've made it through pretty much all the homeworks that have been submitted so far. So if you have submitted a homework and you have not gotten it back from me with feedback on it or a grade or something, check and make sure that the files that you thought you had loaded on it actually did load, because and if they don't get corrected in the next few days, I'll figure out a way to contact the people. They're only a handful, 5 or 6, but I want to get a hold of the folks who haven't actually gotten the submission to me yet and make sure you've got the homework done. Then the second part of your homework, so there are just 2 parts, is to write your name down as you want it to appear on your certificate, because I'm going to be giving everyone who successfully completes this class by watching the classes and doing the homework assignments. Everybody gets a certificate that is equal to roughly 10 hours it's a certificate from the Permaculture Institute, for one thing, saying that you have completed this course successfully, but also it gives you 10 hours of credit towards the diploma in permaculture as well, should you decide to go on to the diploma. So that's the homework, and I'm just going to pop forward to the next slide for a moment to say thank you to all of you, because this has been just terrific fun for me, and I hope that all of you have had a good time at it.